when the former CEO, Paula Reynolds, left, she received a fair amount of benefits under the incentive programs over payments over the years, with a long-term incentive program payment of almost £250,000 and a short-term incentive bonus payment of £143,000 for the performance year 2018-19. So that's just 1 year. So she got that when she left, and I'm not aware that there's been any attempt to claw that back from her or anyone else. What went on in terms of the culture, we don't know, as I keep saying. But it is definitely a failure of imagination, in that you have a range of options as to what went wrong. But the only one you focus on is that the individual was the thief. That it's very important, and this goes back to the point you just making, George, that the post office or any organisation must not be vindictive to those who raise concerns. It's like rule number one: you do not take it out on the people who raise concerns.
Alan, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And you're currently based at UCL, but it would be really helpful if you could give us a potted history of your background and experience and expertise.
Well, thank you very much, Jill and George, for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. In terms of my background, I'm trained both as a lawyer and a chartered accountant, but never actually practicing as either. But I did. But a tremendous training and experience there. I did work in Whitehall for many years in what was the Department of Trade and Industry, and again a very good training as well provided by them. And then I worked for several decades in financial services, both in regulation and also in a couple of banks, mainly on the retail commercial side, most latterly 10 years with Santander. And while I was at Santander, I went on secondment to help set up what was called the Banking Standards Board. And the aim there was to improve culture and ethics in banking. And the organisation still continues under a slightly different name, now called the Financial Services Culture Board. And it's chaired by Lady Susan Rice. I then retired and went off and did my PhD. And I'm now, as you say, a lecturer at UCL in the Laws Faculty. I'm also Deputy Director of UCL Centre for Ethics and Law. So these subjects that we're looking at keep coming around. And as you know, the Centre for Ethics and Law hosted a panel event in the summer looking at what had gone on in the post office debacle.
Yes.
And we will have another event, the Centre for Ethics and Law will have another event probably in next year, when we hope that the independent report on what went on in the post office is published.
Oh, that's one to look out for.
Yes, so well, that'll I assume that will have a fair amount of publicity when it comes out.
Great.
Excellent. So we're looking at the post office today and the scandal that's been going on for years, it seems, Alan. What are the most important issues do you see from the ethics perspective?
Well, there are many. The issue that obviously all of us have got is that we have no insight currently into what actually went on within the post office. We have a couple of select committee hearings, which were very good, but it's just one snapshot. There are some judgments in the review cases that came out, but other than that, we don't really know what went on. So we are limited to general supposition at this stage, but hopefully the independent report will produce more. But if I can look at a number of what I think are key elements, I've as a disclaimer, I can't say whether these were issues or not within the post office, but there certainly were issues that sort of raised questions in people's minds. The ones I'd like to sort of pick up are whistleblowing and the raising of concerns. And we could look at that one. Let's probably start off at that one and see how we get on, because each one is a vast topic. In terms of whistleblowing, what I've seen from my research and experience is that in any organization, there's always been at least one person, and many times others, who had a concern about what was happening. And they either raised their concern and the concern was, let's call it, quashed or diverted in some way, or they, for a range of reasons, did never raise their concern. But people knew that something was untoward in the organization. And there are many instances of that in a number of cases. It's a shame in many ways that boards, and this takes us really to the corporate governance side, but we'll focus mainly on whistleblowing. It's a shame that boards don't spend more time, many boards don't spend more time on whistleblowing. It's particularly for non-exec directors, and sometimes as these exec directors, it's like gold dust for them, because it gives them an insight as to what is going on in the depths of their organization. And they need to listen as to what's actually happening, because it will give them this insight and inform them as to where the risks might be, which they can address. If just giving one brief example, actually a terrible example in what happened, I don't know if you recall the Herald of Free Enterprise, which was a ferry that sank in Zeebrugge Harbour in the late 1980s, and 200 people unfortunately lost their lives. And the reason it sank as it came out of the harbour is that the bow doors were left open. And for a variety of organizational reasons and individuals not taking responsibility, no one thought that it was their job to close the bow doors, but that's another story. And obviously the water flooded in, and the ferry tipped over and came to rest on a sandbank. A number of captains of the company of these ferries had raised the concern with the board and the other senior executives on two scores. One is that their ferries were being overloaded and had too many passengers and too many vehicles on board. So that was an issue. And the other one concern they raised is that they had no method up on the bridge knowing whether the bow doors were open or closed, and the windows as well. So there was no cameras available focused on the bow, and there were no warning lights or anything at all like that. And these concerns, this wasn't just raised once, these concerns were sort of rejected and dismissed by the senior management, which is absolutely quite extraordinary. And the independent report that came out, the judge's report on the disaster, sort of highlighted these things and said that the board didn't understand its job and didn't understand its responsibilities. And if captains of ships, had their issues being dismissed, what chance have more junior staff got in terms of being heard? Yes. So there's a lot on the whistleblowing side which I could talk about.
I can imagine with a big company like the post office, if you're in charge you're so removed from the vast majority of employees that it would be, you'd actually have to make an effort, wouldn't you, to get to know what was happening. And I can't imagine many directors do that in reality. Would that be a reasonable thing to say?
I think it is, unfortunately. It is very, very difficult for a non-exec director, and sometimes the executive directors as well, to know what is going on inside a large organization. There are many layers of management. There are all sorts of reasons why that is difficult. And as you say, it is part of the job of the board and the senior executives to find out what is going on. And there are all sorts of methods they can use to do that. They just need to do them, and they need to do them effectively. So I can talk about staff opinion surveys. That has a whole range of applications as one element. There are things that I've described in my book in terms of what can be done. The board has access to a whole array of tools and methods of finding out. They will have control functions. They will have internal audit, very powerful one. They'll have possibly risk units. They will have possibly a compliance unit. They will have in-house legal team. These are people that will help them to do their job. But they need to use them and need to use them properly. And
the post office have a whole branch of investigators, by the sound of it, which, quite apart from internal audit, would be responsible, presumably, for actually investigating what the problem is, if there's a problem.
Yes, I don't know what the full remit is, but yes, definitely the investigators will find information. I was going to mention the Wells Fargo bank case, and there they had investigators as well, because the issue there was that from the, let's call it the customer's perspective, almost 1.5 million accounts were created that were unauthorized by the customer. They were created by staff. And the bank had its own investigators to find out what was going on that was happening in the branch network, because they were worried about, let's call it, the systems being manipulated and gamed, which might have a detrimental effect on the finance of the company. And the investigators did a good job. However, and did report this information to the board. However, the board perspective was wholly wrong, and I can talk about that as a separate issue. So investigators are very useful, but you need to have the right mindset in using them.
I was about to say that, don't, Alan? The culture has to be from the top, doesn't it? They have to be telling people they're willing to listen. Otherwise, I can imagine it would be quite, for some people working at the lower echelons of a company, they've got no access to anyone who's really in charge, and they will feel fearful of actually saying something, I imagine, for losing their job or not being believed or being seen as just an irritant. You really do have to make sure that everyone understands from the top that you will be listened to if you have something you need to say.
Yes, that's absolutely true. There are a number of key factors in having an effective arrangement for people raising concerns, whistleblowing. These include what's called cultural permission, that you are permitted as an employee or a contractor or whatever you happen to be, who's dealing with that particular firm, to raise your concern. And not only that, but your concerns that you do raise are welcome. So you need that element of permission. Staff at all levels need training as to what to do and how to raise concerns and how to deal and treat people who have raised concerns, and how to escalate those concerns. There needs to be adequate feedback provided to the whistleblower that we take your point seriously, and this is what we've done. Okay, so as things go on, so whistleblowers, people who raise concerns, need to have the feedback that is all worthwhile. Even if it turns out that it was a false trail for whatever reason, you still need to respect their judgment in raising the concern.
Well, you can hardly imagine a culture less suited to that than one which is ferociously prosecuting anybody where a problem has arisen. The first thing that happens is they're whisked off to a recorded interview, not even following CPS guidelines to protect them.
Yes, certainly. Let's call it the various indicators that we've got may show that whistleblowing just wasn't either effective or it didn't take place at all. Who knows? The other elements is that it's very important, and this goes back to the point you were just making, George, that the post office or any organisation must not be vindictive to those who raise concerns. It's like rule number one: you do not take it out on the people who raise concerns, and all the concerns they raise have to be taken seriously. It's too easy to dismiss them. You have all the trite phrases, sour grapes, conflict of personalities, the whole range of excuses, and it's very easy to minimize concerns that are raised. Oh, it's just an issue of a bad apple, and you've got unfortunately, a very classic example of this with what happened with the Mid-Staffordshire NHS hospital.
Yes.
With a superb and long report by Sir Robert Francis on the subject. And again, that sort of exhibits all of the wrong behaviours. So people in the hospital trust knew that things were seriously wrong here. I don't know if you recall what happened, but let's call it patients' interests were the last thing on the agenda. Actually, literally, were the last thing on the board's agenda, and so you had very high mortality rates. You had patients that were literally drinking water from the
flower vases,
because no one would answer their calls. They were starving, and you had even the ambulance drivers in the area knew about these concerns, and the story was, as reported by Sir Robert Francis, is that if they picked up a patient, they would try and take them to a different hospital trust rather than go to one of the Mid-Stats hospitals.
I think another part of a story is one of the women who were at the forefront of making complaints. She ended up having to move from where she lived because her life was made a misery for raising these issues.
Yes, the trust was, and the staff working at the trust were very vindictive, as you say, and people were sort of, I don't know how to describe it, sort of excluded from not just their work area, but also from the society in which they lived.
Yes.
But if we just return to the post office issue, because you now still seem to have a culture in which there's a kind of whitewash going on, in which the new chief executive, I believe, is saying that the reputation hasn't suffered significantly as a result of this scandal. And there's a definite sense of reluctance to reconsider their previous actions, their conduct. They're being kind of forced step by step to review it.
At huge cost, of course.
So it doesn't feel as though there's an atmosphere even now where employees would feel that it was a good atmosphere in which to raise issues.
Yes, the answer is I don't know. None of us actually know what the current position is. What we do know is that, as you say, the impression is the Post Office has not voluntarily come to the position of doing the right thing. It's been dragged there through the courts, and it doesn't come across as being an organisation that is open, transparent. It is one which has seen the light.
You read out in your interview for the other podcast, Alan, some of the parts of the accounts, the reports that were annexed to the accounts. And am I right in thinking up until 2019, there is nothing in the accounts which says anything about the scandal?
If you go through the actual the financial accounts, there's almost nothing, and you have to come right up to the most recent sets of accounts before you see this coming up as being an issue at all, or certainly a material issue. It's barely mentioned. It's very much in what are called the footnotes of the accounts as being there is a dispute going on. If you, what's interesting is that this might take us on to something else. One of the key elements was the incentive programs provided to senior executives, and I looked at the accounts for 2018-19, and they give the impression that if a senior executive or any member of staff who gets these incentive payments receives one, they can be clawed back in some way. There's a variety of ways of doing that. They say that, if I just look at it and read out from it, clawback provisions for executive directors exist in their contracts. And these provide that for the return, the clawback, of any overpayment in the event of misstatement of the accounts, error, or gross misconduct on the part of an executive director. Okay, so misstatement of the accounts, error, whatever that error could be, all sorts of things, and gross misconduct. Okay. And clearly, for whatever reason, the post office didn't think this gave them sufficient power to claw back any payments they had made. This is obviously an issue for their lawyers, their legal advice. But what they did do is in the report and accounts for 2019-20 is that they revised their contracts. And they said from 2020, so only going forward, the rules have been strengthened, these are the rules for clawback, to provide for a reduction or clawback of bonuses where the executive has contributed to serious reputational damage of the company, a material corporate failure, or some other exceptional event. Okay, so you might say that the debacle, the scandal of the post office was not an exceptional event. This suddenly went on for 20-odd years. But anyway, this is the wording that they. It's
just the normal function of the post office, in fact.
Yes, exceptional is something that, like an act of God or something, but that's not the case here. So this is the wording that they've obviously now got in their contracts, but it's only going forward. And if you look at in April 2019, when the former CEO, Paula Venables, left, she received a fair amount of benefits under the incentive programs over the payments over the years, with a long-term incentive program payment of almost £250,000 and a short-term incentive payment bonus payment of £143,000 for the performance year 2018-19. So that's just 1 year. So she got that when she left, and I'm not aware that there's been any attempt to claw that back from her or anyone else. So incentive programs are clearly very important, but they're obviously for many years, this goes back to your point, this wasn't an issue recognized within the post office itself. and by its non-executive directors, because all of this is run by the non-executive directors, okay? Which is an important point. The whole point of the bonus and payment systems, incentive systems, are that they are independent of, let's call it, the executive. Mm-hmm. But clearly the non-executive directors, for whatever reason, didn't appreciate this as being a issue until we come up to 2020, essentially last year, where you've had a whole range of issues being highlighted over the years, certainly by the court cases.
How can you explain that, Alan? Is that because the amounts of money are trivial in post office terms, or is it because there's a kind of this occurs when there's kind of shared blindness on a board, or how do you think this happens that people don't notice?
I don't know, is the straight answer.
Well, in this case, you can't know, but
yeah, no one knows, except the people involved. The scope that the Post Office had, this is per their accounts, for clawback of these bonuses previously was very limited. Misstatement of the accounts, well, I assume they mean a material misstatement of the accounts. I don't know why they focus on that for some particular reason, but they do. Error could be anything, but reputational damage to the Post Office could be seen as being an error, but for whatever reason, it was not seen as being sufficient grounds for clawback. And then gross misconduct. Well, again, this is subject to whatever their legal advice is to whether what the executives did was evidence of gross misconduct. But this is, in my opinion, inadequate in terms of a system for clawing back bonuses. And that's based on what I've seen, the changes over the last, 10 years or more in financial services, where certainly major reputational damage to the organization, potential reputational damage to the organization, should be seen as being the basis for clawback, amongst other things. And they've now brought that in, but it's very much using the cliche of stable doors and horses.
Of course, I can suggest that it might be possible for people to decide themselves that they might pay it back, but I doubt that there's ever been an example of that. But
there have been some examples.
Have there? Well, that's good.
People have honorably done the right thing, whether they've been pressurized by family, media, whatever. But yes, some people have.
So there's hope yet, perhaps, Alan.
Yes. This goes back to the mindset of the individuals. It's one of the classic statements that came out of the parliamentary examination of the directors of the failed banks in the financial crisis, is that even after the failure of their organization, these are very, very senior people, one of them responded that we thought we were on the side of the angels. And this was after the event. And this is looking at hindsight. They still thought they were on the side of the angels, and they had done everything they could. If I go back to the Wells Fargo example, there the company saw itself as being a good community bank, and it had a very high reputation. It had not had any problems in the Great Financial Crisis. The board and the senior executives did actually see themselves as being on the side of the angels, and made a great play of this as well. It wasn't just a throwaway. They went out and said, look what we do. We have our visions and values statements, and we live with them. They won all sorts of awards for community service, best bank, customer service, and so on. And that has a risk that it generates a sense of hubris within the organization. And actually, there's been some academic studies, empirical studies, saying that if you, let's call it, create a sense of, let's call it standing, entitlement, you end up with a high risk of people seeing themselves as justified by their actions, and their actions are good because of who they are and their position and how people perceive them. There's some fairly extraordinary things that, so if you say to say doctors, you're professionals, you've high social standing in the community, they start to believe their diagnosis, no matter whether it's good, bad, or indifferent.
It's terribly good. But there have been religious wars throughout history which illustrate that sense of entitlement. You can crucify people if you think that's, it's for the better good.
If for the greater good, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Or it was justified because of your position and standing, and how you're perceived.
Yeah.
I don't know, Alan, if you've got any idea about this. I'm not particularly meaning to consider it in relation to the post office, but as part of, they are part of this group of organisations where things can go seriously wrong. If you've got people who have the conduct that has existed has been really, appalling. It's the only way I think I can describe it. Do you think they can change? Do you think actually you have to have new people to come in and the whole board got rid of, and new people coming in and taking it from the position of we accept what is being said about this business. We weren't involved. We accept it. We're going to put it right. Because if you're involved, it's very difficult sometimes to accept things and to want to put it right, especially if a lot of your reputation is in question, your pay is in question, your job is in question. Why could how could you do that even?
It is very difficult. If we go back to the NHS, the Staffordshire trust case, there you end up with a series of defences that are put in by the senior executives, the boards, whereby they first say people raise data, mortality rates, and they say the data's wrong. And then people said, no, the data is absolutely correct. And then they turn around and say, your analysis of the data is wrong. And then it goes on. The next one, they say, you've been found doing this thing, which is bad. And they turn around and say, yes, but it's only there because it's attracted media, social media, press, and it's blown out of proportion. And everyone else is bad as well. All the other foundation trusts are bad, just they haven't been found out yet. And so anyway, the point is that you end up with this whole series of psychological barriers to accepting that anything has gone wrong. And again, this is well documented. Therefore, it makes it very difficult, as Angel, to accept that you're at fault and to change.
So you're explaining why I think a lot of these sub-postmasters and mistresses are thinking, why is this not happening? Why isn't the promised looking into this really going to happen? And why are all these obstacles being put in our in front of us, even after there's been a court hearing? So these are all the reasons why, of course, aren't they?
Yes, the whole range, the reasons that go on a legion. In terms of, let's call it, defensive barriers, preventing acceptance of responsibility and personal accountability. It's a factor of the psychology of many of these instances that I've reviewed. Inevitably, you end up with a change of people at the top to put things right, and you need to change the culture, and that's very difficult. If anyone's interested, there is a fantastic interview. Interview is not the right word. A cross-examination by Senator Elizabeth Warren of the then CEO John Stumpf of Wells Fargo, and it's sorry, it's quite a long cross-examination, but the salient points actually probably take place in about 5 to 10 minutes. And she's very well prepared, so she has all the information. And she points to him and says, what did you do to take personal accountability for what went wrong at Wells Fargo? Because in your visions and values statements for the company, you say, if things go wrong, you CEO will take personal accountability. What have you done? And he says, well, we sacked these junior staff. And she says, but what about you and your team, the senior people who are involved? I'm not talking about junior people, I'm talking about you. And he starts to mumble. And she goes on and says, well, so you haven't taken any personal accountability at all. And says, have you resigned? Have you taken a pay cut? Have you rejected your bonus? Have you paid back your bonus? And then she goes on in terms of how much he's earned and says, you haven't returned one dime. And it goes on like this. And at the end of it, he resigns at the end of the hearing.
There and then.
There and then.
In the witness box.
Well, yes, he goes out and then makes a statement resigning.
He had to be humiliated.
It was very humiliating. And it comes down to, his lack of accountability, but also that Elizabeth Warren had done her homework.
Yes.
Anyway, what we haven't seen is anything like that here.
No.
It takes a well-prepared select committee of investigators to do this, and the individuals themselves to accept that there's their own personal accountability.
Eventually, so there's the issue of whistleblowing. There's the issue of bonuses, and what are the other issues that you?
Well, the other ones I could pick up would be the issue of culture and the measurement of culture. It's fundamental to all of this in terms of what was the culture in the organization. Most organizations don't have one culture, have a number of cultures. And it's the right cultures demonstrate personal accountability. We talk about transparency, understanding of what I call the other, that having a different perspective from your own perspective and imagining what the customer, the sub-post office, the employee, what their perspective are and what their interests are. So it's having a high level of imagination, both by individual employees, sub-post office managers, but also as you go up through the layers, the management layers and eventually the board. And it's been described, actually Hannah Arendt described it as being in a much more serious context as a failure of imagination. The inability to imagine what the consequences of what you're doing, the effect on others. And that's a key part of culture, being able to understand and empathize with other people who your actions have an effect on.
That's a very interesting issue. It's a very difficult one to measure, isn't it? When we were doing, I mean, Jill and I spent a long time assessing families from the point of view of whether they could look after their children or not. And one of the key observations that I observed while we were looking at these families was that the ones who succeeded in showing that they could understand their children and empathize with them and therefore respond to their needs appropriately and therefore were safe to look after their children were parents who had a sense of humor. Yes. Because one of the key aspects of a sense of humor is the ability to look at situations from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And you know, very difficult thing to measure, of course, but when you know it, when you see it, if you're surrounded by po-faced, serious people at all times, you can begin to doubt whether people are actually able to see around the corner at another viewpoint. But a sense of humor seems a very good measure of whether or not people are able to do this empathy and understanding of other people's viewpoints.
It's certainly a part of that. you have what we'll call fun organizations that try and do this. That it can generate other things as well, what are called tribalism. In that, and again, going back to Wells Fargo, but other ones as well, that you had the development of very close-knit tribes within the organization that were very defensive. And they tried to generate a sense of fun within the organization, but in the wrong way. So they used to have events where everyone dressed up, all the regional managers and branch managers dressed up in themed costumes. Okay?
That's such fun, yeah.
It's supposed to be sort of like party night atmosphere. And then they had a process by which people ran the gauntlet, that's their term. And so people would line up in these costumes. It sounds absolutely hideous. And the individuals would take their turn to run up the line to a whiteboard at the top to write up their sales achievements in that particular time. And the idea was that obviously if what you wrote up was lower, significantly lower than what it should have been in the general perception, it's a form of ritual humiliation by the tribe. It's something like Lord of the Flies. And they ended up with all sorts of euphemisms. So what they called Jump into January was one of the ones, which was essentially starting the new year with a big burst of sales. And a part of that was through these tribal rituals. And these tribal rituals in companies can be extremely strong and very effective. I've, in a variety of contexts, I've attended some of them in a beneficial sense. They weren't nothing like the Wells Fargo one described, and they are very much like a revivalist meeting. With music and images and things like that, and where all the devotees are there. It's quite extraordinary and very effective in terms of this kind of warping people's minds for good or ill. So there'd be beneficial ways of doing this as well.
It sounds like the kind of fun that people with no sense of humour would think up.
Yes, well, I have to be fair that some of these actually were very effective, but for good purposes. They could be for charitable work and things like that. So, it can have a very dark side, and certainly with, say, Wells Fargo and other firms, it did have a very dark side. So there's been research in terms of this tribal approach. Anthony Saltz did a very good report independent report on Barclays Bank and the culture there, done for the incoming chief executive, which is important, the incoming chief executive. And he described the various tribal cultures and how the investment bankers would look down upon what they sort of call their oafish colleagues working in the retail banking sector, and saw them as people who they could use to sell investment products to retail customers, because these people were sort of way down in the Barclays pecking order. So you have that. There's other research done looking at trying to change culture. So getting away with doing away with sales targets, okay, but substituting activity targets instead. So how many calls did you make as opposed to how many sales did you make, because you can eventually correlate calls to sales. And they would, in particular branches or call centers, people who had not made sufficient effort to undertake these activities would be awarded a cabbage for the week. So a cabbage would appear on their desk as a form of sort of tribal humiliation, and they could only move the cabbage off their desk if they the following week achieved the right target. So you have what are called cabbage days. There are all sorts of things like this, and these are all areas whereby this level of sort of tribal activity and psychological pressure can drive the wrong activities.
Mm.
So we've certainly heard. We've certainly heard accounts of the most extraordinary behaviour by the post office employees who are investigating the sub-postmasters and behaving in ways which are very hard to understand. Worse than, I mean, you can't even make the comparison with the way the police have to function and the way the CPS functions. And there has to be an explanation for how it was that a culture like that spread so far down the organization that you have this dogged pursuit of a kind of vindictive attitude, which is absolutely astonishing.
People were being locked in rooms, people were being bullied, they were being threatened.
And denounced, we know you're a thief, we know that, don't stop wasting our time.
I'm ex-CID and I know a thief when I see one.
So it's an astonishing account.
Hours and hours of being berated in a room by people. And
it's hard to believe that these people all started off kind of unreasonable, outrageous people. They must have picked up a culture which passed through the organization right down to the people who are on the front line dealing with the face-to-face with the sub-postmasters.
Yes, we read these dreadful reports. What went on in terms of the culture, we don't know, as I keep saying. But it is definitely a failure of imagination, in that you have a range of options as to what went wrong, but the only one you focus on is that the individual was the thief. Unfortunately, it is a psychological offence we see relatively often in general life.
If you're at the top of an enormous, sprawling organisation, Alan, though, what kind of level do you think it should be appropriate for people to be looking at conviction rates, for example? I mean, if you are able to do private prosecutions and your rates of conviction rise incredibly over a period of time, what level of, how high should that be relevant to people in an organisation? It seems like nobody knew or nobody cared, and yes, it's a real red flag, I would have thought. We suddenly have people who we've employed for years, they're all now thieves. I mean, how can you even believe that?
It's very difficult. Normally, managers, the boards, the subcommittees of boards will have regular reports being produced on a whole variety of areas. And these reports will always, or should have, there's called a dashboards of key indicators. Okay? And that can be a problem in its own right. And it's a question whether this information first makes it into the report and whether it appears on a dashboard that, let's call it, resonates with someone looking at it. So who knows what reports the post office executive team got, or what reports the board and the subcommittees got. These could be, who knows, very voluminous documents received, say, each month with key material buried in them. Not deliberately buried in them, it's just that it's a very big document and it has to go somewhere. So it's not highlighted, it's not brought out, it's not explained in clear terms. That is a possible thing, is that the committees, the people who looked at these things, were, let's call it, overwhelmed by paper. And you end up with, again, cliches, trees and woods. So that is an issue, and is an issue in many companies in terms of identifying what's really important and making certain that information is highlighted to the decision makers. And I don't know, conviction rates, what was going on is a bad area, and one that may have not been escalated. But it also depends on the mindset of the people reading it. We talked about the data. Well, I talked about the data and how that data is analysed. Mm-hmm. So you again, going back to Wells Fargo, they had their investigators, and the investigators were looking at people manipulating the the reward system within the bank, and the investigators found about 1,000 people a year who were sacked because they were found to have manipulated the systems, and that is reported to the board. But the organisation had over 100,000 employees, and the chief executive is on record as saying, "But this is a tiny number. These are just bad apples. This is a tiny number that actually looks pretty good to me. Only 1,000 people out of over 100,000. So what's the issue?" And that's possibly a form of analysis used in other areas, including the post office. I don't know. How you interpret data is equally important. The other data that you might look at in terms of the post office, and also in my case, Wells Fargo, is that they had a 40% turnover of branch staff. 40%. So if, on day one, if 10 people turned up, only 6 of you would be there at the end of the year. And I don't know how organizations operate with that high level of turnover. Apparently, it was higher than other equivalent financial services companies, but lower than some of the retail operations, such as shops and stores. So it is very difficult for an organization to operate with such a high level of turnover of staff. As a former manager, I know that these numbers are just extraordinary, and it means that you're wasting your recruitment process, you're wasting your training, you're wasting your management time on people who are not going to be there, and there's no continuity. It's very difficult to develop a positive culture in those circumstances. I've got no idea what the turnover rate was in the post office, but there are other factors you might look at, not just turnover. It's sickness levels, people not turning up to training functions, people going on long-term sick. Or people recurrently going off on sickness, and then you look at what the sickness issues were. Maybe stress is a key factor, and it's that level of granular detail that you need to focus on, not just let's call it the conviction rates, but what does it tell you in different pockets of the organisation? Because you have to go down into the detail, into the granular detail. If I go back to my personal experience, Abbey National, which was the prior manifestation of Santander in this country, had empirical evidence that it was the worst bank for customer service in the UK, and all the banks had the same measure. External firm did the reviews, and you got this information every month showing where you were. And so you had these line graphs showing top nationwide, one of the top ones, Royal Bank of Scotland in Scotland, very high, and so on. And then right at the bottom, you had Abbey National. And why was that? What are the issues? So we developed a strategy to try and improve customer service. And it wasn't any one big thing. It was a whole range of things, but it was senior management focus and board focus. And the view was that it would take a number of years to improve. And because you were trying to change not just staff perceptions, which is important, but also customer perceptions, because they recall problems back some years as to what actually happened and what went wrong. And so you need to be able to show them up, but things have changed, and not just change one-off, it's a constant change. So it took about 7 years to change that completely and to bring it way up on the objective scale in terms of customer service. And as a customer now of Santander, I find actually it's marvelous, fantastic. I really but it didn't used to be like that.
Yeah.
And it is a process, but it is senior management focus on the issues and trying to find out by talking to people what's going wrong, talking to customers, getting feedback, listening to customers. And there were thousands and thousands of interviews of customers on a daily basis. What do you experience? What do you find? These done by external firms. What complaints do you have? And how you deal with customer complaints and issues. And targets, how staff are being treated, facilities, continuity of staff, goes on and on and on. But it is this attention to detail, and that's what does it.
And the leadership have to recognise there's a problem and want to solve it.
Yeah, I was about to say that the whole centre of it has to be an admission and a recognition of a problem, doesn't there?
You have to recognise that there is a problem, and you need to interpret the data. The data is your bottom of all the league tables. You need to interpret that data, not explain it away. You can always explain it away.
Yeah,
it's very easy to explain it away, but you need to interpret that data and say this is wrong. Many things are going wrong that we, senior management board, need to address, and we need to do this not just as a one-off program. Some hyped program that will last 6 months, a year. No, this is something that we will be doing for 7 years and longer.
And that's what we should expect to be hearing from the post office if they really are wanting to put things right.
Yes, it's very, very difficult to know and understand, but you would expect to see that something was not right, okay, seriously not right. We, the post office executive, non-executive directors, if no one else, need to recognise this. This is our outline plan. This is what we're going to do, and it's going to take a long time. And we welcome input from sub-post officers, contractors, the employees, all the stakeholders, and clearly the customers themselves. What's their experience? What are the issues? How do we improve?